Howdy, everybody. Happy 2025, everybody. Welcome to Friday News Lunch. Yes, it's another season. This is Friday News Lunch from the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Kevin Mahoney.
And I'm Cyril McLega.
And each week we'll serve up the week's top stories affecting our communities and the nation. Well, we hope you will join us live every Friday at noon on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or right on the Beacon's website at buckscountybeacon.com. We're going to need independent, community-supported progressive media in the weeks, months, and years ahead, folks. There could not be a better time to take a moment, head on over to buckscountybeacon.com, click on the Support the Beacon button, and become a supporter. You can become a monthly supporter for as little as $1 a month. $1 a month. You can become, you can be a regular supporter at $5 a month, yearly supporter for as little as $50 a year, or you can even drop a one-time donation to help keep the Beacon's critical lens focused and sustainable. Well, let's see what we got on the menu for the beginning of 2025, shall we? Big day, everybody. Donald Trump was sentenced today after being found guilty on 34 felony counts related to the misuse of election funds to pay hush money to the adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election. Trump will face no prison, no fines, or any other penalties after being given an unconditional discharge by the New York judge. The message to the rest of us is clear. Accountability and punishment is for us, not for the rich and powerful. Well, that's pretty much sets up 2025 pretty well, don't you think? Jeez. Well, Pat LaMarche reports in the Bucks County Beacon the latest homelessness figures from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. According to the report, homelessness in Bucks County rose 25% in 2024, exceeding alarming nationwide trends. And PA Senator John Fetterman continues his tumble into Trump land. Fetterman is set to meet Trump at Mar-a-Lago, proclaiming, "I'm the senator for all Pennsylvanians," unless you happen to be an immigrant or someone who's trans or gay or a woman, apparently. Fetterman compares Trump's Greenland talk to Louisiana Purchase and the Purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire. Yep, tumble right down that hill, Johnny. Fetterman also meets with Trump's nominees and pledges on Fox News, keep an open mind and informed opinion for the confirmation votes. Yeah, that would have played well in 1994, maybe. And Democrats are in full retreat on immigration. Surprise, surprise. And what does Laken Riley Act have to do with Laken Riley afterwards? After all, I mean, almost nothing, maybe? Wildfires in and around Los Angeles continue to burn out of control. At least 10 people have already lost their lives and more than 35,000 acres have been consumed by flames. Over 10,000 structures have been destroyed and more than 180,000 people, they assume that is an undercount, have been evacuated. And another big story for the week, Meta surrenders to the right wing on so-called free speech on all its social media platforms. Hopping aboard the pro-Trump tech bros train, Mark Zuckerberg announced that he's following Elon Musk's lead in letting misinformation, disinformation, and hate to flow freely on all the platforms. The new Meta policy will now give the green light to calling women property, comparing protected groups to feces, filth, or primitives, and quoting from the new policy, Meta says, quote, "We do allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality when based on gender or sexual orientation," unquote. That is literally in the policy. Well, if you want a clear-eyed sample of what many social media platforms will look like as they embrace this right-wing media strategy, well, check out Tom Hartman's piece published in the Beacon. That piece is called, quote, "What will be the impact of social media plunging us further into a post-truth crisis?" Yes, great piece by Tom Hartman. Great breakdown of kind of like phrases and particular strategies that we're going to see. Can't ask for more than that. Thank you, Tom Hartman, once again. But more importantly, Cyril, welcome to 2025, man.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Good to be here with you. I think.
Yeah. I think want to apologize everybody for like last week. We were going to go live last week. We ran into internet issues to start off 2025. We were both really charged up, ready to go. We're just like, this is it's not worth it because you're not going to hear half of what we're saying. So apologize for taking a little extra week before we got back in the seat. Um, but before we launch into the say I was going to say doom and gloom, but I don't want to say doom and gloom because but just the reality of our situation. um uh how has 2025 been for you so far, Cyril?
It's, it's a mixed bag. On the personal
Uh-huh.
level, everything's pretty great, except that s still recovering from dengue, more or
Hmm.
less. It's really kinda, like, weakened my immune system. But politically, just, looking at the state of, you know, the United States and the state of the world in general, um, there's not a lot to be enthusiastic about, to say the
Hmm.
least. A lot of things to actually be concerned about. But with these issues and with these problems, there's opportunities for hope, and a lot of that lies in communities kind of organizing themselves to kind of resist what most likely will be awaiting us once Trump is inaugurated. As well as just for independent media outlets like the Bucks County Beacon to kind of arm the citizens and voters with the information they need so that they can make informed decisions about the issues that impact them and their families most.
Yeah, that's a lot of what I've been thinking a lot about, how to just kind of be in this space in a productive way. And what keeps on coming back in my brain is kind of less hand-to-hand combat and more foundation building at this point.
Yeah.
I think if anything, what we're seeing, I mean, the Trump conviction today was just kind of like icing on the cake of what we're seeing here. Is like there's we've seen the failure of say mainstream institutions for some time now. And again, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush here by saying like the media capital without recognizing the amazing work of reporters that has been reporters and journalists and writers that have been doing the hard work. But when you start looking at cable news in places like MSNBC or even the Washington Post, the New York Times and stuff, the editorial stuff in terms of the how they're covering things, um, it's just not functioning anymore. A lot of those institutions, as important as they are 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 built for a different media environment. And the idea that we can let justice run its course or that we can depend upon these institutions to solve problems, it's not going to happen. I mean, the accountability, as we saw in the Trump case today, the accountability is going to rest on what we do. We can no longer rely upon the courts. We can't rely upon kind of like the mainstream media just to take care of things for ourselves. And that's that's for me. I guess I've been thinking that it's not a just a question of will, right? Like I'm just going to will my, yes, we're going to do this. No, we really have to put concerted effort into building long term. And I was actually the other part of this morning that I was encouraged by. I got an email already. My classes don't start for another couple of weeks. Got an email from a couple students already that are wanting to organize and to protect people and communities that are going to be vulnerable going into this administration and finding ways of defending things like higher education and so on. So that's, and there's a lot of that out there. But I think, shifting gears a bit, at least in my own brain and kind of the where I generally go to is really having to shift brain into kind of, this is the long haul here. We can't burn all our fuel in the first 3 months.
No. But what's interesting though is that I feel like we're talking about the media, and while the media, um, the mainstream media, like let's just say like the New York Times, they do some great work, but they consistently, through the decades, they often, drop the ball on these kind of the most life and death and biggest
Yes.
political issues, right? So if you just go back to like, let's just say, the Iraq War, right? With the New York Times coverage of the Iraq War, with Judith Miller,
Yep.
or the fact that the New York Times held this bombshell expose by James Risen about the Bush administration's secret NSA spying
Yep.
program on citizens, like going around FISA warrants, because they didn't want to be perceived as like altering the election, right? And part of it was because the Bush administration asked them to hold it, and
Right.
they acquiesced, right? They genuflected to those in power. That's part of the reason I think we kind of like find ourselves in this situation that seems even worse today.
Well, I was thinking a lot. It's funny you bring up the Iraq War here. I was just thinking about this yesterday about how similar the lead up to the Iraq War and the initial coverage of what was happening in that war remind me of just of what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, is like we can look at some of the reporting in the New York Times now, which is much better than it was a year ago, right? But that's after you know scores of thousands of people have been eliminated
Hmm.
by Israel in Gaza, right? We've seen like and a complete lack of critical analysis of things like, oh, oh yeah, now Israel's bombing Lebanon. Oh, and now it's going to go into Syria, right? Oh, as if this is normal, right? And that's what I kind of mean about the institutional stuff, right? It was because really what's at risk there, and you kind of pointed to this, what's at risk for these institutions. And when I say these institutions, I'm not talking about, most of the kind of like, shoe leather reporters that are doing about, but I'm talking about the editorial staff and the kind of, and the established folks within places like New York Times and so on. They don't want to lose their ticket to the club.
No.
I mean, it's really comes down to that, right? Because if they were like they're concerned, they don't want to be perceived by who,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if you're talking about do they care about how they're being perceived, right, by immigrants that are being brutalized by what kids in the LGBTQ community are facing? Do they want to be perceived as kind of neglecting them? Apparently. So when you're talking about perception, it's the perception of other elites. That's it.
Yeah.
and that's and that's really, that's how I keep on thinking about the failure of these kind of institutions.
It's the worst of kind of like access journalism, right?
Yeah,
And what that stands for. Um, yeah.
absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm just curious. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm just, speaking of failed institutions, I mean, this came down right before we went live today. We got the news that Donald Trump was indeed sentenced today. He was found, guilty for, on 34 felony counts, but then was given an unconditional discharge by New York judge. Basically means he's going to face no jail time, no fines, no probation, nothing. Right? What's your take on this?
Yeah. I mean, is it surprising? No, really. I mean, I don't think anyone should be surprised. Like the criminal justice system, again, like we were just talking about institutions, like that's one institution that has multiple institutional biases, right? And you can break that down along, race and class, and it's not just about like the 1%
Yes.
and the 99%. There's different gradients of
Yep.
that.
100%. And I think that's, and again, for someone coming out of like the Black Lives Matter struggle, for example, people who've been pointing to the absolute like inherent systemic racism and classism embedded in our justice system. They're looking at, Trump being given basically a free ride, except for like now he's got like a word. associated with him, and that's it. The felony means nothing for him. The rest of them are like, yeah, of course, right?
And again, like, what Trump, is guilty of, at least what was proven that he was guilty of in this instance. Like, let's just go back to the Iraq War again. I mean, there was never any kind of accountability or justice for the highest level members of the Bush administration,
Never.
including George Bush, for say torture, right? Like, we tortured people. That's a violation not only of like domestic law, but international law and treaties, right? Um, we, you know, it wasn't a few bad apples. We know, in fact, that it was a program. It was a plan. Like John Yoo, their legal counsel, kind of gave them legal justification for this quote unquote enhanced interrogation program, which, and some in the media, again going back to them, kind of parroted that language,
Yep.
that euphemism for torture, and no one was really ever held accountable for that. And never mind, like, with the extraordinary rendition program, where we actually outsource the torture, right?
Yep.
We're like outsourcing the jobs of the US torturers to other countries. And while we're talking about, like, you know who's Trump's nominee for director of national intelligence,
Oh,
Gabby,
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard,
Yep. Yep.
right? Everyone's talking about like her connections to Assad, which are disgusting. But like, one of the things we did, or the Bush administration did, is they outsourced torture to Assad, right?
Yep.
We actually sent people to Syria to get tortured there, and never mind, one of them was an innocent Canadian named Maher Arar, who was swept up at, I believe it was JFK Airport, because and it ended up, there was just a discrepancy in names. And we never apologized for that, and we never gave reparations for that. But yes, we sent this innocent Canadian man to Syria to get tortured for that. And then, nothing ever happened. No one was ever held responsible for that. So while I obviously think Trump should have gotten some kind of sentence, right, for this, and there's other things that never kind of really made it into the court of law. And part of the problem is, the Biden administration, and in particular Merrick Garland, just did really an awful job kind of expediting the process. I have no idea why they drag their feet, and that's part of the problem. But yeah, while this is just a miscarriage of justice, again, it's nothing new. And like, impunity for our highest leaders is as American as apple pie. And probably that started with, at least in the modern era, with the pardoning of Richard Nixon, which never should have happened.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm even thinking about how, like, some of these people say, like, in the Bush administration, and you see like this recurring of kind of like Democratic Party leadership strategy in the aftermath of these major, what should have been major scandals. Like, I'm thinking about kind of taking Colin Powell, for example, the guy that went to the United Nations and lied to the United Nations about weapons of mass destruction. Right. We can say whatever we want about whether, like, how fully read in he wasn't on this stuff, but like, that is something that happened, right? That helped pave the way for international quasi approval of what happened with the Iraq War, right? And then we see afterwards, we see like Democratic Party establishment and liberal establishment and things like that be able to kind of look back Colin Powell and just basically welcoming into the midst, like, well, 100% as a kind of hero that's exposing things, right? We did exactly the same thing with Lynn Cheney, right? Lynn Cheney, who sit there and was at the forefront of some of the most abusive anti-abortion policies and right-wing conservative policies, right, in the Republican Party for decades, right? And because she was like said Trump bad man, right? We're gonna basically welcome her in and show her to be the hero instead of, because, in part because Democratic Party has not does not understand the way that you play politics both officially and unofficially, right?
Or even worse, the celebration of Dick Cheney's endorsement
D-
of Kamala Harris.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, and like, and they don't seem to understand, for like people like you and me, a whole generations of people, when you do that, you basically like, you're telling everybody throw your hands up because you're giving up the game. I mean,
Yeah, you don't stand for anything.
you don't stand for anything, right?
Not
You
stand
you don't
for
you don't stand for anything. And again, and that's been one of the frustrations for a long time. So again, we got a lot of building ahead of us. There's no doubt about it. But and we'll see that when we'll talk about John Fetterman in a minute, because we see whatever the hell is happening there. But before we get there, I do want I Pat LaMarche had this great piece in the Bucks County Beacon, right? We have the new figures that came out from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and she had this great piece looking with a specific focus on what's happening here in Bucks County. Walk us through that, Cyril.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we try to do at the Beacon is just look at national stories and kind of localize it, right? And I think we're the one outlet here in Bucks that strives to do that. And so I saw that these HUD numbers came out, and I talked to Pat, who is just on our kind of like poverty and homelessness beat in Bucks County, in addition to some of the other things that she writes about for us. And the numbers are just really disturbing. Just nationwide, there was a full increase of 18%. Um, you know, uh, in 2024
Of
from
homelessness, which is
yeah,
significant in its own right.
yeah,
Right.
and then in Bucks County, it was even worse. It was nearly 25%. And I think like this is something that we kind of take for granted because it's not visible. It's not right in your face. Um, and it's not something that's kind of on the front pages or kind of like leading the television news programs. And it's something, if we have any kind of like compassion as a community and society, it should be something that really troubles us. Now that being said, I don't want to pretend that people aren't doing stuff about it. Like Pat talked to all these advocates
Yes.
in Bucks County that are doing great work, but obviously, more needs to be done, and probably more can be done at both local, statewide, and federal level. One, to make housing more affordable, right? Which is a huge problem, not just across the country, but I think even exponentially more so in Bucks County. I think the cost for just a one-bedroom apartment on average is, I believe, like 12 or $1,500 a month, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's insane. And what we saw also, and what advocates pointed out, was that what made this past year really bad was just the kind of rolling back of COVID related anti poverty measures.
Yes.
So, we had this kind of like, this disaster, this pandemic, which kind of like forced the government to actually do something that's hasn't been very kind of American, and that's extend the social safety net, right? It's something that you see more in maybe like in Scandinavian countries. And what happened when we expanded the social safety net? Homelessness and poverty levels fell, right?
Yep.
And so we have to kind of get back to that kind of mindset, and in order to kind of protect our most vulnerable neighbors, who are not just folks our age or elders, also includes children that are homeless in Bucks County.
100%. And like, just for example, a really concrete example of what you're talking about there, under the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's kind of main piece of like a main piece of legislation. I think it was under that, or maybe even came before. No, it came before, about the childhood tax credit, right? So basically, in one bill, one policy, right, cut the amount of childhood poverty in half. Now, initially, right, if Biden got what he wanted, right, that would have all but eliminated childhood poverty, right? But no, the Republicans said, no, 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 it's too expensive, blah, 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 blah. So 50%, right? So we got 50%. Like that was just not extended by the Republican Congress,
Yeah.
right? So that was like a perfect example. And if you just basically take that money, who is basically took kids out of poverty and like bettered their whole family structure because there wasn't such a strain on resources, that's taken away. Of course, you're going to see like impacts of things like homelessness, right? You're going to see impacts on kind of like lack of nutrition, right? You're going to see impacts on test scores. I mean, all those things that are impacted by a policy like that. And I think kind of to your point now, I hear I've been back and forth with some folks kind of locally about this, but and I think the messaging is really good is thinking about, okay, this is where we can have the impact right now is kind of locally, right? So thinking about this is a great time to be really, if you don't know who the county commissioners are, now's the time to figure out who they are. If you don't know who is your local mayor and on city council, this is the time to make sure you know who you are, because these are the people that we are going to have to we have the most direct ability to have an impact on. And thinking about, on the one hand, things like mutual aid, how do we keep people protected and fed and housed, right? On the other hand, what kind of policies can we put in place that are going to kind of build that kind of like social safety net from the ground up as best we can.
Yeah, and I would like to point folks as well. There's kind of like, kind of a companion piece almost, which was a photo essay by a student journalist who's from Doylestown, but he goes to school at George Washington University. But he's back in Bucks for his winter break. His name's Cooper Tiksinski. His brother Aiden also writes for us, and he took a trip over to the Bucks County's Code Blue shelter, which is hosted by the Coalition to Shelter and Support the Homeless. And for this month, for the month of July, it's at Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church in Doylestown. And what the Code Blue shelter does is that, you know, it it's opened. The doors are open when the temperatures outside feel like 28 degrees or lower, which is just awful, right? And even if
Right.
it's just like 32 degrees, like who wants to be outside, when it's just, when it's just freezing. Um, but he had a really nice essay that kind of like shows like what's happening locally in Doylestown, what some of the volunteers are doing, and what something like that means for the Bucks County's homeless population, which is growing. And this is a story that we're gonna that we've been covering, that we're gonna continue to cover. Not just about yeah, there's this problem here, but kind of like highlighting the groups and organizations that are making a difference, so that you in fact can, if you have time and if you're interested, hopefully you are, you can volunteer or even just give a few bucks, right, to help out. That could be a meal for someone.
Right.
And just moving forward, Pat's also, she's going to be coming out with a story next week, to talk about some successes combating homelessness in neighboring Chester County. And maybe that'll give us some ideas about things that maybe we can do more effectively here in Bucks.
100%. 100%. I mean, excuse me. Pat's been doing, great work for the Beacon for quite some time, and her focus in this piece is great. I mean, uh, go over to buckscountybeacon.com, check out that piece by Pat LaMarche, and while you're there, she's got a bunch of links in there to local organizations, the work that they're doing. Check them out, help support them if it's the kind of thing that you feel like you can get involved with to help support them or volunteer your time. Great places to check out. I put one of the links up there for the Coalition to Shelter and Support the Homeless, which Pat mentions in the article and highlights. But there's more there too as well, so do check it out. Now, Cyril, one of the things that you had put a bunch of suggestions that we focused in on today were with like, what the hell is going on with John Fetterman in his like increasing tumble into I mean, I don't know to call it mansion land or Trump land.
Yeah. Um, and part of me thinks like he does some of this and says some of these things just because he likes the attention, right? Which is something that was pretty obvious even, before he was elected into office, right?
Right.
He liked trolling people, or, at least his social media team, but initially did, and then it seems like he's kind of like, carried that mantle with him, and yeah, so, there's a few things that have kind of like been drawing heat for him. Um, you know, should we talk about maybe like his stance with Trump's nominees? What's your take, on that initially?
Look, I outside like in like in a normal kind of situation, right? If this was kind of normal times, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's where what Fetterman's words are kind of catching on, especially kind of like the liberals. Well, what do you do about this? Because it sounds really reasonable.
Mhm.
It's only when you put that in context and place, right? So he's saying that on Fox News, right? He's saying that on Fox News. Why is he saying it on Fox News? Well, if you actually watch we'll put the link in the show notes. If you watch the entire piece where Fetterman is interviewed and you watch the follow up on Fox News, like what happens after his interview or after his discussion, the little round tables, they're like, see, look at this, liberals, like, people who are like really liberal are now coming over to see that this is a problem, totally there to help justify and bolster
Yeah.
what the Trump administration is doing. That is true for what Fetterman is doing as a co-sponsor of the Republican bill on immigration.
Mhm.
That's what's happened with these nominees. Any reasonable person from the center to the left who's looking at Trump's nominations, you cannot run away from the fact that number one, these are unqualified billionaires,
Yeah.
right, who are being put into positions for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to destroy. Right? They don't have qualifications. You can't talk about the qualifications. You can't even talk about what their program is or what the work they've done in the past on these things. All you can do is saying, here's somebody else who's on board with the Trump train. I mean, so unless you start from that place,
Yeah.
right? And then you want to say like for political reasons, right? Well, of course, right? This is what I'm seeing, but they're going to come before and they're going to get a hearing. And that's the purpose of the hearing. The
Yeah.
purpose of the hearing is to ask these direct questions to these people, and then we go forward from there. But Fetterman does not do that. Fetterman just goes out and say, "Hey, I'm just open-minded," like as if he knows nothing about these people, and he doesn't have an entire staff of people around him to do all the research to tell him about these people if he doesn't do it on his own. I
I
mean,
mean,
it's just that's the problem.
yeah, he's definitely kind of, sane washing Trump
Totally.
with these appearances, and the fact that he offers like absolutely zero critique, right? I understand, like, someone like, we'll say, Marco Rubio, right? Like that might be Trump's like sanest pick, and despite like not agreeing with, you know most of what Marco Rubio stands for, like, I don't see that there's a problem with like giving him like the green light as Secretary of State, right? Is that what it
I
is?
think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can barely keep track
um,
of these people.
but with someone like RFK Jr. or Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard, to not have anything to say, and there's plenty more, but we'll start with those three. To not have anything to say about their one, lack of experience, or two, their at best checkered, if not insane or criminal past. It's a dereliction of duty, as a senator who supposedly represents Democrats, as well as Republicans, in Pennsylvania, because both Republicans and Democrats need to hear these critiques. And these aren't just ad hominem attacks, right?
Right.
There's a paper trail.
Right. And you see there's some of these talking points that they recycling on Fox News and some other of the kind of conservative outlets now are kind of like, I'm not going to start with hate.
Mhm.
Right. And that's how they're branding people like Fetterman and some of these other kind of like whatever, like mansion wannabes or whatever to come on, is basically to say like, hey, no, we're going to kind of be reasonable because we want kind of like maintain civility and all this other kind of stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about going out and tearing people down for no reason.
Yeah.
You've got like court documents and like histories of convictions and like tattoos on, I mean, come on. Pete Hegseth with like fascist militia tattoos on his body.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, these are not things. And someone like Fetterman, here's what drives me crazy about Fetterman. Like, I've interviewed Fetterman before a couple times, matter of fact. And he's incredible. He would be so easy for him to say on a place like Fox News, like, hey, look, I represent all Pennsylvanians, right? And some of my Pennsylvanians have been victims of sexual assault. So
Yeah.
you bring someone like Peter Hegseth forward with this kind of history, that raises some questions.
Mhm.
So that's the purpose of the hearing, right? So in that soundbite, you could do that, right? And then, but what he wants to do is he wants to say he's doing something like Bernie did,
Yeah.
right? Because one of the things, I actually agree with what Bernie Sanders would go on Fox News,
Mhm.
right? And I agreed with that stance, that
Yep.
he'd go on Fox News and that he'd be willing to engage and argue. But he went there with an understanding of what was going to happen, because he knows how this stuff works, and an agenda, right? And I'm going to respond from my position, not just to kind of make sure that I'm securing my future appearances on Fox News, right?
Yeah, and it's funny that it's hard to fathom now that like Fetterman was once kind of compared to like Bernie
Yeah,
because of his style of so-called progressive politics. But I often wonder how deep they really were. To begin with, he seems like someone, at least now, to kind of go whichever way the wind's blowing, right? Um, and I do wonder, like, just regarding like his difficulty with like communication and stuff. Whether him going on these shows is the best way for him to effectively communicate. Because maybe if he's like writing more like op-eds, right, he can
right,
kind of get into like more nuances. And but I don't know. It just appears to me that like he has a tough time kind of responding, off the cuff, or kind of like pivoting or changing directions, because of the stroke that he suffered.
right, right.
Which is obviously unfortunate, and I don't think it precludes him, from his position by any means. But it's just a critique about how that kind of, hampers his communication. But even if that never happened, I still wonder, like, what he'd be saying and how he'd be saying it now. Um, but yeah, like you said, like Bernie, when he would go on Fox News, like he would have like his political message that he was pushing, right? It wasn't to kind of slap Fox News on the back and tell them how great their political program is. It was about putting out the Democratic, or unfortunately, it's not even the Democratic platform, but his ideas should be part of the Democratic platform, about how universal health care, raising wages, strengthening unions, and we're just not seeing that from Fetterman. And at this point, um, you know, he's lost a lot of support within the Democratic Party, right? I'd be surprised if he isn't primaried when his reelection comes around. And I also like wonder, you had mentioned Mansion, if he's gonna just kind of slide into that Mansion cinema role that seems to be like wide open, um, and maybe kind of like flip parties, or declare himself a quote unquote independent.
Right. Well, I think, after watching after watching his Fox News interview, I got thinking a lot about, like, well, what is he doing here exactly? Right. And I actually think that what he's doing is following the Joe Rogan playbook. And anybody watches Joe Rogan, one of the appeals of Joe Rogan, he comes across and he cultivates this, just an average guy sitting down having talking about some stuff, right? And Rogan almost always approaches his guests with almost this sense of like, I'm just interested, I'm just curious about these things that I want to find out about, right? As if he's not the largest podcast in the world, has a sweetheart deal with Spotify, has an incredible, like, large staff that could give him all the research and background possible. So he goes in there as if he's just kind of like some random guy, just kind of like interested in different questions that people might bring to the table and learning about it. And that has kind of earned him like a lot. Joe Rogan has also been, like, responsible for the short path to fascism for a lot of people, right? Because of what he does here. And so I think this is just a gut feeling that Fetterman, because Fetterman is not dumb, right? So, but I also don't think he's just kind of like just doing Joe Manchin for Joe Manchin. I think I mean, even like this whole hoodie thing and all this stuff, I think what he's trying to cultivate, he's going for this Joe Rogan thing,
Yeah.
right? But that Joe Rogan position ultimately leads in really, really bad places for a whole lot of people, right? Those other Pennsylvanians, which you seem to be not considering, John Fetterman.
Yeah, and now he's off to Mar-a-Lago soon, right?
Yeah, well,
What's that gonna be like? I don't even I don't even want to read about it. Right? I can't even imagine how vomit-inducing this is gonna be. Um, you know, I'm surprised Trump just doesn't make him, like a nominee for some kind of cabinet position, right? And then the Republicans can try to pick up another Senate seat or something in Pennsylvania.
well, if the Democratic Party leadership is in, you follow their, what they've done in the past. Most likely, what they're going to try to do is appoint him to an important position over an important committee to work with the Trump administration, so that they could sink any other possibility of some, resistance. That would be what the Democratic Party leadership has done in the past. But I don't even know who the hell's the Democratic Party leadership at this point, because they seem to not be able to sort that out. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe they'll put him as their point man for immigration, right?
well, yeah. Well, here you go. And that's a perfect place to be, right? Given his co-sponsorship and the fact, as you've kind of pointed out here, the Democrats are in full retreat
Yeah.
when it comes to immigration. So walk us through this, what's going on with that, and the Laken Riley Act,
Yeah.
and how that plays in.
Yeah. I mean, sadly and tragically, Lincoln Riley was a young woman who was, murdered by an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela, right? And so, what the Republicans have done is kind of just use this as a political cudgel, to politicize, some very real issues, that we're facing at the border. And for me, part of the problem is that the Democrats, the only thing that they've really done over the last 4 years around immigration, um, was just kind of like, say that they oppose like the MAGA position, which, they should, right? Just kind of like militarizing the border, kind of vilifying, any kind of immigrants that are coming in as criminals and rapists, as, quote unquote, poisoning the blood of our country, right? Which is what Trump had implied or actually said while he was campaigning. And they never really offered their own kind of policy program to deal with immigration, right? And by doing so, they kind of ceded the framing of this issue
Yes.
to the Republicans completely. And they lost an opportunity to kind of like craft policy around, one, common sense, right? And then two, like compassion, right? We should have compassion for these people that are fleeing their countries, either, because of, extreme poverty, or extreme violence, or because of, systematic discrimination, whether maybe it was, just being like an LGBTQ person in certain countries in Latin America, can be very dangerous. Fleeing abuse or conflict, and so, and even with the um, with the legislation that the Democrats tried to get passed for the border that that Republicans were ready to vote for until Trump made phone calls and said no, he didn't want this because this would be a political win for the Democrats, and a political loss for him. That was something that they didn't even really craft themselves. They ceded that to James Langford, a senator, from Oklahoma, who by all accounts, like he seems like more of like an institutionalist, and he's someone that like kind of like will work across party lines and that yada yada yada, but he's still like a hard right, you know, Christian nationalist and like
Right.
and somewhat xenophobic senator. So they couldn't even they couldn't even take the lead on that themselves, and so what we're left with is just this kind of this Lincoln Riley bill, which was really just started off as a messaging bill, for the Republicans, um, and after opposing it initially, most Democrats in the Senate opposing it initially, um, they all kind of they flipped, right? And then
Yep.
they after the election. So it's just like, what do you stand for? Did you actually oppose it before? Because it really didn't change, and it doesn't protect dreamers, right? Which Democrats proclaim to care, who Democrats proclaim to care about. It doesn't do that. Never mind. It just kind of, it essentially puts the Constitution in the toilet and flushes it because it would allow law enforcement to hold undocumented immigrants who are charged with crimes such as shoplifting, because this was something that the person who murdered the undocumented immigrant who murdered Lincoln Riley, he supposedly or allegedly was picked up for shoplifting. It allows law enforcement to hold these people and then keep holding them even if they're found innocent, right? So you're like in indefinite detention.
Yep. And there we go. I mean, this is complete complicity, right? If you ask me, kind of on this. And another part you were kind of talking about this about seeding everything and the seeding or kind of basically joining in a Republican framing of this stuff, right? And one of the kind of marks of political competency, right, is to be able to kind of not just have a position on something, but be able to kind of like frame that position and to argue for that position. And that's what turns things long term. What's crazy to me about what the Democrats like fear, it's all it is, that like if they say anything different than the right wing position, then they're going to be held, then they're going to be in trouble for their elections. Is they're seeding some of the most beautiful and rich aspects of American history and part of that narrative, right? I mean, again, we could talk about all the complicated history. I'm not even talking about the reality of the history within here, but the stories about America, about a place where people come for freedom, where a place where people come to build new lives. That's the richness of this country, is the richness of its immigrant history, right? I mean, that is a well established narrative and that is not controversial, right? But that is the narrative that is being attacked by the right and has been attacked by the right, who want to keep this country as best they can a white Christian nationalist country, right? The rest of the people, right, that are kind of like that are not invested in just that, right? That's the richness of it, right? It's the kind of like the reason why like a place like Percy has like an Indian restaurant and a Chinese restaurant. I mean, little crap like that, which is the stories that people recognize in their lives, right? That are part of like what they grow to know what America is. The Democrats just like throw that out the window because they're afraid that if they stand up for immigrants and seem too closely associated with immigrants, that that Republicans are going to attack them for it. Yes, they will, but use that as your strength. Right? They are attacking those very things that we tell our children are part of the American story. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it really it's worrying. Like, the Democratic Party as an institution is not gonna protect us, and, this Lincoln Riley, bill in the Senate, and also there's some local Democrats in the House that, from Pennsylvania that flipped after initially opposing it. It is going to kind of, at least initially, it's gonna come down to community level organizing to protect our immigrant friends and neighbors, and supporting groups like, Bucks County's like Immigrant Rights Action.
100%. Well, we only got like a few minutes left for today, and so I want to say our hearts go out to folks out in California right now, around Los Angeles. Those wildfires are absolutely horrific. And as we kind of find out, kind of in the coming kind of weeks, about how what's the most effective way to help support people that are out there, we'll definitely get that word out to you for sure. But the other thing I think is a good place to kind of say, close out the show and have some focus on is what's actually happening in the media space right now. As we saw, um, like Mark Zuckerberg just basically with his little live event looking like some, I don't know, some weird ass surfer dude coming on the show to talk about Meta. And he's like coming up with this new persona about, hey man, it's like I'm just here to like talk with you, whatever. But basically ripping away, taking away all fact checking, take away all this kind of sense of moderation of what's happening on Facebook's platform and Instagram. Basically saying, Meta is jumping in with the kind of right wing, quote unquote, free speech train by allowing kind of hate and discrimination to happen in their online spaces. So, we're like, walk us through some of this, Cyril.
Yeah, apparently fact checking has a liberal bias, right?
Yeah, yeah. Reality does have this way of inserting itself. So,
And then, there was also something that kind of stuck out to me, the fact that he was wearing like a $900,000 watch as he's giving this, and we're talking about homelessness and
yep.
increasing. Um, think of all everything that could be done with that. But yeah, I think it's worrying because we're seeing now in like real time, and I feel like there's been like an uptick since the election of what can happen to a social media outlet like Twitter, now X. It's a complete kind of cesspool of, mis and disinformation, just extremist ideologies. Um, uh, from neo Nazis to white nationalists. Although, what's interesting is that despite I wouldn't even say it's Elon Musk's tolerance for it, but support of, the Right for Bucks leader Andy Meehan has been banned from Twitter, so he couldn't even meet the bar, the very low bar. Somehow he's too offensive for Elon
My
Musk,
God.
who welcomes neo Nazis and white supremacists and porn spam to Twitter. So there's the Bucks County Republicans representing for us nationally or
Go
internationally.
Andy.
Yes. But it's dangerous because everything I just said. Facebook is kind of like opening the doors, and not that they were able to completely get rid of it in the past, but it's about kind of legitimizing hate and extremism, and we saw and what we've come to learn over the last 10, 20 years is how these spaces are an organizing tool for these groups, such as militias, right, who were
Yep.
very active on Facebook, and then Facebook started pushing them off. And what I expect is that we're going to start seeing these like 3%er groups and their splinter cells start coming back. And these are the people, these militias are the people that one were responsible in part for January 6th. Two, had planned to kind of kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, right, and have like public executions outside of the state house. So it's a huge danger for democracy on that step, and it's also just kind of, I think it's just going to further widen the gulf, between, um, you know, I guess you would say, like, between Democrats and Republicans about, reality and what's news. I mean, it's always been a problem. We've seen that, in the years going again. Well, I'll just keep going back to the Iraq War. 10 years after, 15 years after the Iraq War ended, and we left, like Republicans, like I think it was like 66% of Republicans still think there's weapons of mass destruction there, and a lot of that had to do to bad reporting um, you know, by organizations or media organizations like the New York Times, and then bad faith reporting from organizations like Fox News.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And so much to say. So I'm going to slow it down here and say a little. um, One of the biggest concerns that I have about this too as well is kind of the point you were making there at the end, is like really what's at stake here is the ability to filter what is actually happening, right? And turn everything into kind of opinion. Now this has actually been it's one of my classes, we go over this, some of this stuff is like you have right wing strategists for quite some time. We read this great book by Nicole Hemmer called Messengers of the Right, which is really tracking right wing media from like the post World War II era up until 1980. So not the period that we normally think about for right wing media, but she's looking at the rise of talk radio at the end of it, but even before that with this right wing media strategy. And very early on in right wing media strategy, the idea was is that you have to go after the legitimacy of fact, right? You have to basically find a way to say that this objectivity in reporting, right? What journalists were claiming to do at the time, right? As best, even like best possible, trying to be objective and do like places like New York Times and so on. You had to basically turn that and say that what they're doing, their media strategy is this quote unquote objectivity. And that's how they sneak in their liberal bias, right? So you're basically going after the very idea of objectivity. And you're saying objectivity and reality is actually a liberal strategy, right? Why that was important. And this was like, I'm literally explicitly discussed by some of these early right wing strategists and it's continued, it's come back again. We see this with, I'm forgetting the dude, the guy who's the head of the new college down in Florida now was
Christopher Rufo.
Christopher Rufo. He's referenced some of the stuff explicitly in terms of his own strategies, right? As to say that you got to go after that because once you're able to kind of turn everything into opinion, the question is, who do you trust? Right. And then who are the people that you're going to trust? And look, like it or not, the right wing has built extra institutions outside of the quote unquote mainstream. A lot of that is through churches, right? A lot of that is through these kind of like the Republican Party as a space where people feel a sense of belonging and they look at other people in that same room and finding out, okay, wait, is this what's going on? That's where they get their confirmation. So it's taken out of the hands of, say, professionals, about people that are doing concrete research that are trying to figure out what's actually going on. And you want to say, you want to basically, you want to, contract that out to churches and other community groups that have a strong conservative bias, right? And then that's reinforced by at the top level, the mega level, by Fox News and this kind of like major kind of right wing media infrastructure. That does not exist on the left, right? The left, like center to the left, has relied primarily on existing institutions like universities, like New York Times and mainstream media reporting stuff to do the work of building kind of narrative and understanding of that stuff. We've relied upon that. And that's, but the right is understood for a long time that that's what you need to do. So what Zuckerberg is doing here with Facebook, right? It's going to release that into that those platforms where it's going to be next to impossible for people to have any sense of what is actually real and what's justified because there's no filtering anymore. Now, I wish I saved this for today because I just I read this article this morning. It was really kind of, I think, an interesting take. I think it was in these times or something like this. But they were saying, and it's, oh no, it actually came up from it was in the Intercept. But one of the points made in that article was that liberals for the long time have had thought that fact checking was going to solve everything, right? And the other that's one part of the story is that fact checking would not ever solve any of this stuff, right? It was helpful, it was a necessary part of it, but that didn't do it on its own. And one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg did in his announcement about why they were turning these policies back is he basically said, we've built lots of complex systems in order to moderate and try to kind of deal with this stuff. And then we find these big complex systems, what they do is they still make errors, right? And then the logical leap that he makes is, thus and therefore,
Mhm.
right? What we need to do is get rid of the moderation entirely, right? And what Sam Cedar made this point. I was thinking this, and like Sam Cedar made this point on the Majority Report, I think on Monday, was exactly what I was thinking. He's like, the only reason that Facebook could not do content moderation properly is because they wanted a way of doing it without paying people to do it,
Yeah.
right? It is a labor issue. When they're talking complex systems, they're saying we couldn't get the AI to identify these things correctly. The only way to do it was to have actual human beings looking at content to be able to make these judgments. They want to remove human beings from this entirely. They couldn't do that through their AI. So now they're just basically saying, well, we're still not going to pay people. We're just going to let everything go to shit. Right. And I think those two things are important, is like the ability to be able to filter the stuff out, and these gigantic multi-billion dollar, if not trillion dollar operations refusing to pay people is really what's at stake in their entire strategy.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback and kind of shift directions a little bit, is just now Meta's going to have AI profiles and chatbots now. Like,
Yep.
it's just this could be for another day, maybe.
Well, but it's that's part of it, right? That's part of it. It's to give people the sense that they're kind of engaging. Look, I mean, the only strategy when you do something like that, you're only doing it for one reason, right? And the only reason that you're doing it is to try to keep people on the platform as long as possible, right? So if you find people that are falling off in terms of engagement, you can send the bots out to kind of like kind of get them back engaged, right? That's the why you do that, because that's how they make their money, right? We got to remember, we are the product on these things. As much as they are facilitate, they're super important for us to be able to communicate with each other and to get this stuff out. That's not their business model. Their business model is to get our data and our attention so that could be sold to these other folks, right? That is the primary purpose of the social media corporations. That's not how we use it. But let's face it, for the entire history of kind of media, that has always been the case,
Mhm.
right? Media has been for the people who own the media, right? The own the and that for the rest of us, like who are fighting for, are finding ways to get our stories heard, right? To kind of find out a ways of building power so that they have to pay attention to the needs of us. Right. That is the vibrancy of democracy. It is not in some sort of CEO of whether you're like of a corporation or a university or a newspaper. It does. That's not where it exists. It exists with us. Like we are the defenders of democracy. Like at the end of the day. So, welcome to the shit show, everybody.
And we still got the inauguration to look forward to.
Oh, you're looking forward to
Yes.
that? Oh man, I'll tell you. But yeah, I'll one last thing I'll just say is that I've been really conscious of trying to not do the doom and gloom thing all the time, right? Because it can put us in a very, I think all of us, I mean us, I mean in this broad sense, by reinforcing how bad things really are, right?
Mhm.
Constantly can just serve not the purpose that we're supposed to. So, what I want to say to everybody that was listening today, right, comes back to this stuff too, is like we we can take care of each other, right? We can move past this, right? As long as we're kind of like building finding each other, finding community, supporting those places that are going to be important. I'll put obviously the plug in for the buckscountybeacon.com. Go to buckscountybeacon.com and check out the kind of how you can support this. Become a member for a supporter for as little as $1 a month, right? But multiple institutions, and we're going to be highlighting those things all throughout this year, right? Looking for the people where the work is being done, kind of locally, so that again we can help connect people, kind of to where the good work is happening. So we have it.
Thanks.
So, Cyril, any last words that you got? I know we went a little longer than we talked about, but any last words you got for folks? Kind of things upcoming in the Beacon, or things that messages you want for 2025?
Sure. Next week we have a podcast episode on solidarity journalism, which I think is going to be really cool and interesting, and how that can kind of help save us moving forward, right? And it can um, help address this credibility crisis that we touched on a bit today with the mainstream media. We have a great guest coming on for next Wednesday. And then I recently read and got to talk to Catherine Stewart, who will be coming back on the show. She has a new book out, and the timing couldn't be better. It's called Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Well, we're here, and this movement is taking over American democracy starting January 20th. So there's the podcast with the Signal. In addition to that, we're just going to keep kind of plugging away at the issues that matter most in Bucks County and Pennsylvania. We have the new legislatures just starting up now, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that. And we're going to be working to kind of expand our coverage and grow even more our stable of writers in 2025, because it's an all hands on deck moment.
100%. I think we gotta leave it at that. It's the best place to leave it. Well, Cyril, listen, I wish you a great weekend, and wish everybody else out there kind of a great weekend. And look, we're here for the fight, and we needed it. As Cyril said, all hands on deck moment. Have an awesome weekend, everybody. Take care of each other.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right, we are out of here. This has been the Friday News Lunch from the Bucks County Beacon. See you, everybody. Money, lies, and God. Whoop, whoop.